I am Dr. Karen Owens, and I am adjunct faculty and director of strategic research at Hood Theological Seminary. Welcome to our second session of the Pathways for Tomorrow Fall Series, Political Actions from the Gospel Perspective. We are honored to have with us our guest facilitators, Reverend Tracy Blackman and Dr. Aubrey Hendricks Jr. You may have already read about them when you registered, but I'll highlight a few things about them both. Reverend Tracy Blackman is the CEO and founder of Hope Builds LLC, a newly launched consultancy for communities, corporations, and congregations eager to build the just and equitable world they imagine. She also serves as theologian in residence for Eden Theological Seminary and chaplain for the Central Region of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. As an ordained minister, public theologian, and registered nurse, Reverend Blackman's life work focuses on communal resistance to systemic injustice. She served as a local church pastor in both the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the United Church of Christ prior to accepting a call to serve as Associate General Minister and Vice President of the United Church of Christ for 8 years. Her messages of hope and healing have been received by national and international audiences, including the White House, the Carter Center, the Pontifical Council of the Vatican. She's a featured voice in Bill Gates' PBS special, The Black Church, the National Geographic special with Katie Couric, America Inside Out, Rewriting American History, and a soon-to-be-released documentary on the 10th anniversary of the killing of Michael Brown Jr. Dr. Aubrey Hendricks Jr. is the most widely read and perhaps the most influential African-American biblical scholar in America today. He's been a Wall Street investment executive, a theological seminary president, a distinguished senior fellow at the Democracy Collaborative think tank, and served in the U.S. Department of State Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group under Secretaries of State Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. Currently, he teaches religion in African American and African diasporic studies at Columbia University. He's an advisory board member at the Institute of Christian Socialism and a trustee of the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI. He's also an ordained elder in the AME Church, an elder scholar in residence at the Children's Defense Fund, and an advisor to the Abolition Sanctuary Social Justice Organization. Among his books are the best-selling The Politics of Jesus, Rediscovering the True Revolutionary Nature of Jesus' Teachings and How They've Been Corrupted. His most recent book is the critically acclaimed Christians Against Christianity, How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith. Welcome, Reverend Blackman and Dr. Hendricks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, at this time, President Dr. Virgil Lattimore of Hood Theological Seminary will extend a welcome. Dr. Lattimore.
Thank you, Dr. Owens, and welcome my distinguished audience. You're in for an enlightening conversation this evening because it's consistent with the, I would say, the tenor and the focus of our founder, Bishop James Walker Hood, who was not only a religious pioneer and a trailblazer in the Southeast United States, but he lent his thought and energy to the political foundations of this state of North Carolina. He served on the commission which founded the state of North Carolina. And I don't think you can be any more political than that, in that you participate in the shaping and the framing of the document of a republic. And so with that in mind, I think it's important for us as persons in theology to not only be versant in what's going on in the political arena, but be wise about how to engage it and how to make it serve what its purpose was created for. So, with that in mind, thank you, Dr. Owens, and I am honored to greet this audience as the second president of this illustrious institution. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lattimore. Now, before we begin, just a few reminders, since we're so grateful for this tremendous turnout tonight. We're asked that you'll please keep your devices muted throughout the session, and it's going to be recorded, and you'll receive it in your inbox in the next week or so. And also, the presenters will be happy to address your questions and your comments, so please put them in the chat. At 7:20 p.m., we'll conclude the session, and we'll ask if you'll be so kind to complete a very brief survey that will also be placed in the chat at that time. This free course offering is presented via the Pathways for Tomorrow initiative of the Lilly Endowment Incorporated. And I also want to thank Mr. John Everett, Ms. Kelly Bryant, and Dr. Sandra Oliver for their valued assistance and support. I'll now turn it over to Reverend Blackman and Dr. Hendricks.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Owens. And Reverend Lattimore, you said my sweater was not wrinkled, but the light, let there be light. It shows everything. So, so I better have something to say to make a difference. This is a very important subject that we're discussing here, political actions from the gospel perspective. I'm going to talk about, as a biblical scholar, I'm going to talk about the biblical foundations and implications for political action. And my colleague, Reverend Blackman, who is a very, very accomplished and thoughtful and far-sighted activist, will talk, and a very accomplished activist, I think we'll talk more about the practicality and some of what she has seen and done. The gospel says, be ye also ready. So I'm going to hide these wrinkles because it's bothering me. And, I'm not going to try to act all formal. I'm just a brother trying to do what he's got to do. Sorry to disappoint you all, but here we go. Well, so, what's so important is that the gospel is political. In fact, the Bible is political in the sense that it's concerned about who gets what. It's concerned that that there is a fair and equitable distribution of goods and services, and more importantly, wealth and freedom, and on down the line. And we see that throughout the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the prophetic books, in the biblical prophets, who talk about equity. And we see it reflected in the saying in Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself, which Jesus echoes as one of the greatest, in fact, equal to the greatest commandment. He echoes that in the Synoptic Gospels, particularly in Matthew. And so when you think about something that seems as innocuous as love your neighbor as yourself, what's often missed is the extraordinary profundity of this statement on every level. Love your neighbor as yourself means to want for your neighbor and their loved ones the same material goods and freedom and security and all the good things of life for your neighbor and their loved ones as we want for ourselves and our own loved ones. And that's economic, political, and social. It's very, very profound, but there's an implication of that as well, and that is because all rational people will struggle to have the best for themselves and their loved ones, then that also loving our neighbor, the commandment to love our neighbors ourselves is also a commandment to struggle for our neighbors to have the best, to have full freedoms and liberation and economic goods and resources and security and on down the line and so forth. And so when you think about it, then this one saying out of so many, but Jesus said it's equal to the greatest commandment, is a commandment ultimately for us to struggle to make the kind of world where all of God's children, all of our neighbors, can have the same rights and freedoms, the same life chances as we would want for ourselves. That is an important commandment to the church and to us in the church, and it gives us an idea of what our political actions should be. It should be struggling for a just world. We see also, and I'm going to stick to the gospel now. In Luke 4:18, Jesus says, after he's been prepared in the desert, going through various spiritual ministrations to strengthen himself, we see him say, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he anointed me to preach good news to the poor." Now, and it doesn't say poor in spirit, good news to the poor, the economically poor. In fact, Jesus talks about the poor and the impoverished more than anything other than God. But what's important in this statement is that Jesus isn't coming on like some prosperity anti-gospel preacher, talking about, well, you can get yours and all, you can be rich. No, 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 no. Jesus is not saying that some are going to be rich and some are going to remain poor, or those who are alive now, they'll be rich. But those who come after them will be poor. No, that's not good news. That's only good news to a few. The good news to the people is one of structural change, that the policies, the politics, the political structures, relationships on down the line, he's heralding that they will be transformed into something that would be good news for all poor people. He's a herald then of structural change, political change. We also see this notion of political change in the Lord's Prayer when he says, he tells his disciples to pray to ask God to empower them to be part of the change. So when he says, God, your kingdom come, your will be done, what is that? That's political change. That's changing the world from Caesar's unjust kingdom into God's kingdom, Caesar's unjust laws to God's will. And so, but that's like the basic, those are so obviously political guidance for what we should be doing. In other words, what it says is that what we in the church and all believers should be doing is struggling to build a just world, and that's politics. Politics is about distribution and redistribution in an egalitarian, just, and fair way. And lastly, the last example I'll share at this moment is Matthew 25:31-46. So very basic. It says, "As you have not done it to the least of these, you have not done it to me." As you haven't tried to feed the poor folks, to make sure they have somewhere to live. In other words, to make this a just world. If you haven't done that for our brothers and sisters, then we have not done it to God. And this is really the foremost judgment of Jesus, because he says, if you don't do this, you'll go to the left hand of God, which is hell. And in fact, that's one of the few times he talks about people going to hell, when you sit around not do anything to help folk. But the problem is that churches don't seem to be paying attention to this. I spoke at a church a couple of weeks ago, a large church in New Jersey. And then a woman asked me, this was before the election. She said, well, why did God allow these Christo-fascists, these MAGA Christian nationalists to get this far, that where Donald Trump is is misleading so many people to do evil. And my response was, God didn't allow, we allowed it in the church through theological and ministerial malpractice. Um, what we heard on the political terrain was usually the right wingers saying hateful things and talking about deporting people and demonizing children who are struggling with their sexual identity and all of that. That's what we heard. We heard very few voices from the church and very few from the black church, who's going to get hurt even worse by Trump, standing up against this onslaught of horror and depravity that we're faced with. And so that is the antithesis of the kind of political action that the gospel calls us to. We are called to change the world. And when we go through the gospel, it's easy to see. I will say this last thing. I should have said this earlier because it's from the Old Testament. Real quickly, some of you have heard me share this before, but it's very important. The ethical concept that's talked about, the ethical/political concept that's talked about more than any other in the Bible, that's cited more than any other in the Bible, over 420 times, is the term mishpat, which we translate as justice or judgment, which is discerning between good and evil, right and wrong, bad and good. This is the foremost ethical/political concept in the Bible, justice. The second most cited ethical/political term in the Bible, concept in the Bible, is the Hebrew term tzedakah, which is usually translated as righteousness, in the sense of personal piety. But because there is no individualistic ethos in the Bible, in fact, there's no word for individual in biblical Hebrew, then tzedakah can't just be about personal individual piety. It must be about social piety, doing social righteousness, doing right in community, doing right by other people. And what's really interesting is that these two concepts, mishpat, English, justice, and tzedakah, doing righteousness in society, doing right or doing justice in society, that they are paired together more than any other terms. And that's the interesting thing. They're paired together more than any other pairing in the Bible. And you'll see it in every division of the Bible. When you think about it, though, the pairing of justice and doing right in society or doing justice in society is social justice. That you put them together, it means social justice. There's no denying that. And I've talked to many of my Hebrew Bible colleagues, and they agree that's undeniable, but it's so significant that we never really hear that. But what that means is that from the Hebrew Bible proceeding in the only scriptures that Jesus had, the foundational ethical/political concepts, the foundational concepts of the biblical tradition actually is social justice, struggling to do justice in society. And so you couple all those together, the things that I've shared, what we see is that the biblical tradition tells us to get out and struggle to make a difference, to build this world into a just world. And it's not just about each of us looking for our own salvation, because Jesus doesn't talk much about individual salvation. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, we have the figure of Simeon, who's in the temple day and night praying for his own salvation. No, he's praying for the consolation, the liberation of his people. That's the ethos, and that's the problem with our churches. That's why we allowed this regime to come in. And I mean, let's face it, the man lied and spewed hatred to get into office, and he told people, he said he's going to hurt folk. He's going to destroy people. He's going to send people out of the country. He said, I will be your retribution. He even said he'd be a dictator just for a day. Who can be a dictator for a day? He also said we might have to suspend the Constitution. We allowed this to happen. And so when you take people like my colleague, uh, Reverend Tracy Blackman, uh, these are folk, and I'm going to defer to her now because she is one of those who has taken this to heart uh, and understands the politicality and the underlying social justice commitment that we're called to by God. And I look forward to her sharing her perspectives, but also some of the things that she's been involved in that has put this into action. Thank you, Reverend Blackman.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hendricks. There's a question that came up while you were talking, and I want to make sure that you saw that question. I'll address it as well, but um, the question's from Donna, and it says, why does the Black church or do Black churches seem to be nonchalant about political matters in the 21st century and with Christian nationalism so prevalent?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you. I'll do that, and then I'll get out of the way. Thank you, my Facebook friend, uh, Reverend Van Hook. Well, so many of our churches now. I mean, we just lost our way. So many are so performance oriented. I mean, I'm going to say a few things that might be unpopular, but when you look at the church and you look at our gatherings, preaching conferences and concerned about preaching performances pervade the church. We have those more than anything else. Not talking about justice, not talking about politics. And then many of our churches um, have taken on what they feel is a Pentecostal ethos. Um, uh, when they think this is Pentecostal uh, when your emphasis is making people shout and make people jump up and down and have a lot of fun and call it church. The Pentecostal sensibility is much more profound than just that kind of performance stuff. Then also we have many pastors who, although they have studies in their church, they don't study other than preaching or biblically related things. And so they don't even know many times the issues confronting our people that are confronting and limiting the life chances of the sheep of the flocks they are supposed to be protecting. If you don't know what is posing a danger to the people's shepherd, then how can you protect the sheep? And then there's this theological problem. It's just that since Constantine in the 4th century declared himself the 13th apostle appointed by God and then took over the church and became Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the church, which is oddly still the post title. That's when he sponsored all these councils to come up with all kinds of doctrines that you're supposed to have to believe it in order to be a Christian in good standing. It was at that point that what one did, which is what Jesus talked about. Jesus talked about what to do more than anything else. He talked very little about what to believe. But so Jesus taught, so the religion of Jesus was based on what you did. I mean, what was Christianity was what you practiced. Constantine changed it so that it became what you confess, what you believe. So folk, it became about being doctrinally correct and talking about you're saved, but not having to get out here and put the gospel into action in the street. So that's my observation on what the problem is. And one other thing, our music is really distracting our people. And gospel music for me is a problem. I wrote an article some years ago, it's been anthologized, but I have to say, gospel music is apocalyptic in that it essentially says that there's nothing that we can do to change the world. The world is or the devil is so strong that we have to leave it to Jesus. Our music even says, leave it to Jesus. And the music has become so entertainment oriented that when people are attracted to the church, like, and I have no problems with Kirk Franklin personally, I don't know him, but for him, for example, talking about attracting people to the church. Well, you when you're performing and you work people up and you're working their emotions, and that calls them to the church, what are you calling them to? Not to the radical social gospel that's supposed to change the world. That's being called to churchianity. It's almost the worship of the church, and that is not what the gospel tells us to do. It tells us to go out and change the world, and the churches don't seem to get it. So those are my observations, and I thank you for the question.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hendricks. I could listen to you all day and just have conversation with you about your comments. I hope that I'm able to add a little bit to this conversation, and I want to acknowledge the presence of those who've taken out time to join us here, and so grateful to see so many of you engaged in this conversation. I want to come from a little bit of a different um, point of view, not contradictory, but just a different. He's from the academy, and I'm from the praxis of congregational ministry. Those are very different. And I treasure every opportunity when I'm invited to speak to seminarians. The question about why do we, as the Black church, not emphasize the political nature of what's going on, especially in the face of white Christian nationalism. I have lots of thoughts about that, but the one I want to start with is we have a tendency to leave our seminary training in the seminary when we get into the pulpit. Now, I know some of you will disagree with that, but I'm saying it to you now because it is harming our churches. The things that we learn to do in seminary, how to deconstruct the text, how to exegete and not eisegete, how to interrogate text in ways that make the text not weaker but stronger, how to look beyond the words, how to remember that we have to look at the scripture first for whom it was written originally in the context of that time before we try to apply it to this time. We learn those things in seminary. And for some of you, if you came from a background like I did, I came to seminary thinking that I was going to glorify Sunday school. And so I knew I was going to make an A because I was good in Sunday school, right? But then you
Yeah.
get to seminary and you learn that Sunday school, like the first time somebody said to me that Moses didn't actually part the Red Sea, I was like, oh, be still my heart. I got to get out of here. I'm going to go to hell for being in this place, right? And then
Mhm.
you begin to understand that the Bible is a people's book, a people's story about a holy God. It's
Mhm.
not God's book about a holy people. We've transcribed those things in such ways that we have rendered the sacred text that is so powerful, we have rendered it unable to do its job.
Mhm.
And I'm saying that to you because you're in seminary now. And I'm saying when you get out and you're assigned to churches or the public square or wherever you go, don't leave the skills and the ability to look deeply into scripture. Don't leave that behind. And it's not something that we haven't always done. We've always found ways to figure out or ways around what the text says about things we don't like, right? But we have to apply those skills across the board and teach our people how to apply those skills, right? So I just want to say that about that. There is a reason. And the reason is because we are teaching an impotent gospel, right?
Mhm.
I want to talk about how I look at this moment and look at movement work because I'm working on a piece right now that says everything I needed to know about this moment I learned in Charlottesville. I was in Charlottesville for the alt-right rally. I was invited to preach the night before to get people ready for a nonviolent confrontation. And when we opened the door, we were surrounded by people with tiki torches, and they were chanting, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us." And I learned that night something that I had miscalculated. I grew up in the South in Birmingham, Alabama. I'm no stranger to Klan rallies. I'm no stranger to segregation. I integrated several classrooms and a couple of schools. So I know racism. I watched the Klan march with the hoods and the sheets on. I've been in those experiences. And so I was not going to Charlottesville with blinded eyes. But what I saw in Charlottesville, it took me months of therapy to recover from.
Mhm.
I was not prepared for racism with the hood off. I wasn't prepared for that. I
Mhm.
wasn't prepared for people who weren't caricatures of themselves hiding behind sheets. I wasn't prepared for young people who looked like they could have been my adult children with khakis on and driving BMWs and Lexus and all the fancy cars with hats on, some of them saying "Make America Great," not all of them saying that. I wasn't prepared for young people half my age to be the majority of people marching down these streets because I made the miscalculation of assuming that racism would die with previous generations. I made the miscalculation of thinking that the new young people, the adults that went to school with my children, that hung out at my house, that they hung out at their house, I made the mistake of thinking that it meant that we had entered a new generation. And I was grossly mistaken. And so when I got that in my head, that racism doesn't die out because the comfort it offers the privilege is desired, that classism doesn't die out because the comfort it offers the privileged and the hope of those who want to be privileged is still alive. It took me a moment to wrestle with the idea that this was a battle we would have to fight over and over and over again.
So how have you been fighting it?
Um, well, I want to talk about the local church. I'm going to sit that there and I'm going to come back and answer that question. Um, Dr. Hendricks, I'll give a short answer to that. I use the gospel in a way that I think it was intended to be used.
Mhm.
Um, I try my very best to do exegetical work that brings the word alive, that points to this radical revolutionary Jesus that Dr. Aubrey Hendricks has written a lot about, that calls out the misinterpretations and miscalculations of scripture that are so prevalent, especially in a world with so much social media. But there are some other things that I did as church leadership that I think are important. And
Mhm.
I want to begin with the concept of what I just said to you about the Bible being a people's book about a holy God and not God's book about a holy people is something that I say very often from pulpit, sometimes welcome and sometimes not.
Mhm.
It does not, for me, change the sacredness of the text because the sacredness of the text is the visibility of God through relationship with other people.
Mhm.
And because I recognize that relationship, not just in that story, but in the story of my ancestors and the stories of other people that I hear, I recognize the nature of God. And that's what makes it sacred to me. I don't know if that resonates with you or not, but that's where I am with it. So even in the Genesis text, when I read that in the beginning, God, And I understand in my belief as a Trinitarian that that God is inclusive from the beginning of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Even in the creation of human beings, the text says, let us create. Let us create humanity. I perceive that and understand that as a reflection of what it means to be made in God's image. Just stay with me for a minute. That
Mhm.
God in God's self is a self-contained family. That God in God's self is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so to be made in God's image is to be made in the image of community, not in the image of individuality. I wish I could talk to you because it's hard for me on a screen, but you understand what I mean when I say that.
Mhm.
That essential to the way I understand God is a commitment for me to care about others,
Mhm.
to be in community, to be in family.
Mhm.
That God never intended the individualism that we practice now. And
Mhm.
so when I was a pastor of a local church, I taught and worked with my people in this way, right? And I'll just give you some examples. In the AME church, where I started and where Dr. Obry is hanging in there and doing good work.
Doing my
Um, if
best.
you know anything about the AME church, if you are going into pastoral ministry, especially if you're a woman going into pastoral ministry, you usually start in a small rural church. And
Mhm.
I was assigned a small rural church 125 miles from my house. I drove there twice a week. That's 250 miles each way for 9 members in a farm town with no other houses around, and it wasn't going to grow. And every time I got in my car to go there, I was cussing. And every time I got to the front door of the church, I was glad to be there.
Mhm.
Those 9 people, mostly elderly farmers, taught me how to pastor, and I'm grateful for that time. They gave me the opportunity to learn how to listen to people, to
Mhm.
meet them where they are, and to understand that in a small church, whatever I was preaching, they were going to ask me questions about it, interrogate me about it, and all of those things made me stronger. By the
Mhm.
time I came to the United Church of Christ, I had been promoted to 12 members. But this time I had a church that seats 500 people on 2 acres of land. We had a house back that in the back that used to be the groundskeepers. And the church is split before I came. They hadn't had a pastor for 18 months. And when I came to that church was a different story that I won't tell tonight. I accepted that assignment and I started to ask God what was the purpose for us being here. The church had been there a long time, so it's not like it's something new and people are going to recognize it. It had been there so long and so dormant that I think many people had just passed by it as a part of the landscape and it lost its appeal. I could stand in the front of the church and see 3 other churches within my eyesight just by turning my body. And there were 6 churches within a 5 mile radius, right? And so I began to ask the people who were members who had once lived in the neighborhood, but now had, um, attained more wealth, had changed their careers, had moved further out from the church, but done something what is typical in Black church, still came back home to worship, which meant they were there on Sundays and they were there for meetings and they were there for choir rehearsal. I asked them what they thought of their neighborhood and how they thought we could grow the church. And they began to describe the neighborhood as they knew it when they lived in it. I knew they were doing that because I had already done my map assessment of the area, but they didn't know they were doing that. So I invited them to meet me on a Saturday and I made door knockers. I said, we're going to canvass the neighborhood and ask people to come to worship. I already knew what we would find, but I needed them to see what we would find. So they met me and we went out and we canvassed, and it didn't take long for us to realize that most of the people living in the homes around the church now were renters instead of homeowners. That was a shift for them. And the neighborhoods weren't going down. I'm not making some trope about it, but it does imply transient residents versus permanent residents. Most of the people living there had church homes that wanted church homes, and some of them had sworn off the church. In this kind of environment, we then went back to the church and they lamented what they were seeing. We had a school across the street. 95% of the students were free and reduced lunch. So that gave you some of the economics of the school. And if you are preparing to finish seminary and this matters to you, I recommend that if you want to be a local church pastor, don't just consider the congregation, consider the community. Do
Tracy, may I
acts that,
interject? Most
yes.
of these people are not seminarians, I don't think. I think that
Oh, you're
they're,
not? Okay. I thought
yeah.
this was a seminary class. But we did a community mapping of that community. And we decided that if we couldn't be People's Church on Sunday morning, we would be the church of the community Monday through Saturday. We opened the doors of the church for community programming. And if you had some vision, but you didn't have a place to make it a reality, if you had some desire, but you didn't have the money to make it happen, you could use the church space for free to incubate your businesses or your dreams. That's what we became. And we quickly went from a Sunday church to a 7-day-a-week church. Within 6 months, we had robotics, we had a cheerleading class, we had girls mentoring, we had a catering business incubating in our kitchen. We had all of these things that made the church more of a community partner. And we adopted a motto that said, be a good neighbor. Now, that's not politics, that's charity, but that's engagement of the church. Along with that, I did an opening series, preaching series, which I call The Door of the Church is Open. And every Sunday for a month, I would pick some issue, whether it was economics, homelessness, childcare, our schools were in trouble. I picked different issues and I would preach about those in relation to the gospel. Every sermon ended the same way. Do you really want to open the door of the church? Because if we open the door of the church now, the people who come in the door may not look like the people who are sitting in the pew. If we open the door of the church now, everyone is not driving the car that you might be driving. If we open the door of the church now, they may not be coming in with a check. They may be coming out with their hand out, needing help with a bill. Do you want to open the door of the church? And every Sunday they would have to respond yes. That final Sunday, I asked the question, not just do you want to open the church so people can come in, but do you want to open the door of the church risking that people who are in may go out, may leave because the church is changing? That began to open up ways for us to enter into the justice work of the streets. Because of that, because of that grounding, because of that pastoral ilk, because the people were with me on that. The other thing we began to do was open up the church for funerals. Now you'll say, why funerals? Because at least in St. Louis, more churches were beginning to deny having funerals, especially if the death was violent, if you weren't a member of the church. And so we were doing those funerals. And if they didn't have a pastor, I would offer my services. If they did, their pastor could come in and just use the larger space. In August of 2013, a young woman was killed in St. Louis by the name of Quinita. Quinita was 23 years old and she was killed in a drive-by. The bullet was meant for her boyfriend who was driving. It hit her in the head and she died instantly while holding a 9-month-old baby. Her family came and asked could they use the church, and I said yes. And they didn't have a pastor, so I did that service. It was standing room only for the service. And after the service, as there was a person sitting in the ceremony in the service that I did not know, her name is Sierra. I know her now. She asked one of the ushers for my card, and she never called me, never came to visit the church, to my knowledge, until August 9th, 2014. That's the day Michael Brown was killed. She lived in that apartment complex. And when she brought her children home from breakfast, and all these people were in the complex, and they walked up on the dead body of Michael Brown, she went in the house and found my card because her children were in tears. And she called and said, "You don't know who I am." She told me the story I just told you. And she said, "Since that funeral, you've been my pastor, and I need my pastor to come to Ferguson." I went to Ferguson as a pastor because the gospel, I believe, commands that we care for one another. I take that over to Matthew 28, the Great Commission. When I read the Great Commission, I see a difference in what Jesus is asking us to do and what we have made central to the church. The church, the Black church, but all church, has become excellent at making believers. We focus on making believers, but we do a poor job of making disciples. And discipleship is about those who will mimic and do what Jesus did in Jesus's ministry. Discipleship is what Jesus calls us to do, to go out and to see the poor, to heal the sick, to feed the hungry, to care about the justice issues of this world.
Yes.
That is the commission. Believing Jesus is easy. Believing in Jesus is easy. The question is, do we have the courage to do what Jesus is calling us to do?
Absolutely.
So when I went out into Ferguson for the first time, we were met by hundreds of young people. Michael Brown was killed on a Saturday. Hundreds of young people. And the very first act, it was in the newspaper. There are pictures. People don't know what's going on. They think I'm just leading a march because I'm standing in the middle of a crowd with a megaphone and I'm screaming something. But what I was screaming was repentance. I was asking those young people who did not know who we were because we had been missing from the streets. And that's bad enough. But what's really bad is that we had not missed them. We had been so self-absorbed that we had not paid attention to the youth that didn't come in the doors, the youth who were in our streets. And there was a disconnect that I didn't know any other way to begin to address except with repentance, because that's what my Bible calls me to do. And so I believe very much that this moment that we are in is not just does not just demand accountability from people who did not vote, who voted 4 years ago. We're 27 million short of that. This moment does not just hold accountability for those who chose an issue and decided not to vote. The results of this election also calls to accountability the church,
Mhm. Yeah.
the gospel we have not preached, the mandates we have not shared, the quick and easy fixes that we have chosen over the hard, courageous work of doing as Jesus did.
Great, great, great.
And I believe that's a part of why we are where we are. We
Mhm.
are addicted to individualism, not communal life. We've
Exactly.
forgotten we've forgotten the essence of the gospel. Um,
And that is the essence of it, yes.
I think I'm going to stop right there because I want to engage with Dr. Hendricks. I love your new work. I do. But the thing I quote the most is when you said that we are compelled to treat the people's needs as holy. And it doesn't get any plainer than that.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, I think it's, thank you, Reverend Tracy. Yeah, you took us uh from the rudiments, I think, of how to um build the trust and the spiritual gravitas needed um to mount and to sustain a serious justice movement. Thank you for sharing for sharing that. Yeah, a lot of what I heard is trust and service that gets people involved. And that's interesting because in Luke 4, from the beginning of the first verse, Jesus prepared himself with spiritual ministration um, before standing up and saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me and anointed me to preach good news to the poor." And so that was, what I heard and what you were doing was similar to that. And so we can have a sustained movement. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to talk more specifically about the things you've done with Reverend Barber and all of that. Yeah, it's our churches, there are things our churches can specifically do too. Many of us know Dr. Smith, J. Alfred Smith, who is pastor emeritus at Allen Temple, a Baptist church in Oakland. Extraordinary man. And first time I spoke there for him some years ago, 25 years ago, maybe, came time for the announcements. And rather than the sister coming down or the brother, but in this case, it was a sister coming down talking about sister so-and-so having a fish fry or the children's are going to do this and that and the other. Those things are important. But what she also said was she talked about what was going on in the community, politically in the state and in the nation. She talked about the kinds of policies that the people should know about, should be concerned about, the kinds of things that were happening conditionally around them. And I said, wow, that is one. So that what that points out is that in our churches, since we have folk who are um, captive audiences, at least once a week, um, part of our responsibility is to raise their consciousness about what's going on around them and to empower them to be able to affect change or to support those who are engaged in building change. And so in terms of the kind of political actions we can take, I think that's important. I think it's also important and you have to have a church, I guess, of a certain size. Well, no, you don't. It doesn't matter how many. Um,
Dr. Hendricks, our church grew to 126 members, but in Barack Obama's first election, um, his first race, um, we assessed. There are a lot of people who do voter education and voter registration, but none of that matters unless you get people to the polls. And
well,
so
yeah, but
we
I,
did mobilization, right? I'm saying in that small church, we took 1,800 additional people to the polls.
yeah, no, I'm not questioning that. Thank you. I'm not questioning that. I'm saying that it can be done. What I was going to say, what could be done anywhere, is have political consciousness raising um,
Absolutely.
committees or gatherings. If it's a small church, you can do that. If you can have a Bible study, or if you can do that, or have a testimony session, you can, a church can do that, right?
Mhm.
All the larger churches could have a committee, a commission, uh, who are charged with digesting what's going on the previous week that the people might know. They could put that in some churches, put it in their bulletins.
Mhm.
Or you can have someone talk about it like J. Alfred Smith did. That's very important. I think, but it's important to have a certain kind of ethos. Obviously you've done that. I know you've done that at the churches you've been at, particularly in St. Louis, Ferguson, whatever. But it's important to have to give the people a certain the church a certain ethos, knowing that it's not just about institutional maintenance. It's about changing the environment that we live in. And so, I look at churches and I love ushers annuals. I mean, I love the great dignity that ushers show in their annuals, and we have these choir annuals and all that. But if we can take folks to Usher's annual, then we can take them to a protest, or we can take them, to mobilize people. And what you did was mobilize them. But what I'm suggesting is that we try to work to make this normative, because it is an expression of the gospel, our gospel responsibility to change the world. Also, and this is really off the beaten path. I guess some might see it as tangential, but we have to start holding our religious leaders responsible for what they do and for what they don't do. Ministerial malpractice is very widespread, and we can tell when we see ministerial malpractice, because churches are null and void when it comes to trying to change even what's going on in the communities, in their local communities. That is not, in my reading of the gospel, faithful to what Jesus tells us to do. And so those are the kinds of things that I think are important when we talk about political actions. With regard to Christian nationalism,
Wait. May I stop you right
this
there?
is a terrible, scourge that we're dealing with, and it must be treated like the harmful, often deadly phenomenon that it is. And that's something else that now there are a number of groups who are writing, and a lot of folks are writing about Christian nationalism. I'm part of a big study group sponsored by PRRI, but we're all writing about Christian nationalism, because not everybody knows what Christian nationalism is, because often we're under the thrall of the national church. But these things have to be addressed if we're going to be faithful with the gospel message, in my reading of it.
May I insert something there?
Absolutely.
I 100% agree with what you're saying, but I also think that too much emphasis is put on the pastor. I the church is about the people too, right? And so it's a danger when pastors take on the entire identity of the church.
I agree.
Church is about the people, and sometimes as leaders we take up too much space. There's a small book written by Eugene Peterson, who did the Message Bible, one of my favorite books. It's a little book about being a pastor. Now I can't think of the name of it, but one of the things he says in that book is you must remember the unnecessary pastor. That's the name of the book. You must remember that a church can be a church without a pastor. A pastor cannot be a pastor without a church.
Well, I'm talking about responsibility.
Hold on, I'm getting there. Hold on, I'm getting
Yeah,
there. So
no,
I'm
the
saying
pastor has the
uh, the
responsibility.
pastor is the leader, but people also have to be engaged. And the way we're setting up church now is consumerist. That's where I'm going with this, right?
Well,
So if
that's not
all
what I'm talking about.
Okay, but let me say this. Okay, if you have churches set up so that people just have to come. When I was going to church, when I was young, you had to be engaged in church. You didn't just
Yes.
and sit, right?
Not an
Um,
audience, a congregation.
Yes, a congregation had to
Yes.
be engaged in church. And so the place I learned to talk so that I can go back and forth with Dr. Aubrey Hendricks on a phone, on a phone call like this is in church. The place that I learned how to do public speaking was in church. You didn't have a worship team. You had a choir, and they didn't always hit every note right,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
you had a commitment to show up to be in that choir.
Exactly.
You had usher boards and not greeters. So people had commitments to do that. People
Exactly.
knew what people in the congregation were going through because it was not an observation sport. It was a participatory moment in worship. And that's all I was going to say. I knew I was going to get to a place you'd be
Well,
okay.
I'm glad you
I'm
said
saying,
that. I'm
yeah,
glad you
that,
said that because
yeah,
one of my observations, and I didn't mention it, but is that too many of our churches are have they build audiences and not
yeah,
congregations. I grew up in church like you did. I write a little about it in this latest book, but Christians Against Christianity. But yes, absolutely. When I talk about the pastor as a shepherd
hmm,
has a responsibility now, but I agree this, but on the other hand, there is a problem when we have these pastor personality cults and, these imperial pastors, and they want to be in control of everything. That's the problem, but I'm not talking about that at all. I'm talking about the pastoral responsibility to, to empower the sheep, to teach, to raise consciousness. I mean, what did pastors have a study for? A lot of them don't study. I mean, they use that for meetings or whatever. That's what I'm talking about. And so, the church, you're right, is ecclesia uh,
called out.
called out. There are people called out. It's about the people. And the Gospel of John, the Johannine letters give us a model of a more communal, leadership, and not just focusing on one person. But if we're going to have a church where, and a lot of folk do put a too many hopes on the pastor, but if that's going to be the case, and it's going to be the case quite often, the pastor has a responsibility to point to other things, and that is one of the reasons, in my opinion, why these folk are winning, because we're giving our people, black and white, give so much faith and attention to the churches and are so faithful, but the leadership is focusing largely inward in churchianity in the churches, and not a lot of people don't even realize that it's not about individual salvation, but it's about changing the world. They don't, I didn't learn that in church growing up. I had to learn that in seminary.
Well,
Pastor
I
responsibility.
wonder if you lived that though. If you had the kind of church I had, they didn't have that language, but there was very much an ethos in the church of having to take care of one another,
Oh yeah, many
of
churches have,
communal salvation,
but
right?
that is, yeah, but it's still within and don't get me wrong, the taking care. I grew up in the kind of church that I think you described. People looked out for each other. The little kids leave church, they slip a nickel or a dime in your hand. Lord, a quarter, you're rich, and
And some
you doing
peppermint.
you doing a good. Yeah, some peppermint. Don't forget that. That's where I learned to be somebody in the church. That's where I learned basic ethics and what love is about, and all of that, and integrity and dignity, and I got, as I'm sure you did, we got a sense of somebodyness in the church, not in a society that treated us like nobody, but in the church. All of that is important. But on top of that, that's what I'm talking about. That needs to be done and to be articulated. Mhm.
Reverend Sam is saying, Reverend Sam Oliver said, white evangelical pastors have no problem shaping their congregation's political views, hence Christian nationalism. So, yes, we have an obligation to preach the full gospel of Jesus. I agree with that. And I would suggest that Black churches don't have any problem shaping their congregation's political views either. Our political views, though, are less. Um, we spend our time, when I say political in this realm, I'm talking about how we govern and live our lives. And we give badges for suffering. We teach the gospel in such a way that the more we suffer, the more holy we are. We accept that it is our lot not um, to be persecuted and not to speak up. And and you all may disagree with me, but it's harmful. Like that too is a politic, right?
True.
Where white evangelical pastors are teaching a theology of chosenness that says because we are white and because God has chosen us, not even the Jews, God has chosen us to be in charge and be in control. And we see that all the way through history. There
Mm,
is a politic that is taught in Black churches. It is
mm,
not that. It is to bear the burden and bear the suffering. It is to be holy as defined for us by someone else other than what God is defining as holy. And so then we begin to turn against one another because if you are queer, then we have to shun you even in the church, right? And white people do that too. But I'm saying we have bastardized the gospel. Both have a politic. And what the Republicans and the Democrats or whoever you want, however you want to name that, I'm using it intentionally, did a masterful job of taking the politic that we have and baptizing it and theologizing partisanship. And so now, even the abdication of language of a religious right versus a liberal left is a problem,
mm,
right? And Christian nationalism is enticing because it is a way of continuing to secure whiteness as supreme.
mhm,
And people, even against their own best interest,
mhm,
are gravitating to that. And the fact that we're not teaching a gospel that can cut through that and give people a faith that they can hold on to and
mm,
demonstrates what a Palestinian rabbi might say to them
mhm. Yeah,
um, is why we are where we are.
yeah.
Um,
I think you're so right. Christian nationalism conflates the flag and the cross. In fact, it holds the flag above the cross sometimes, and it is a real heresy. Um, and Christian nationalism, I call it Christo nationalism. It's also attended often by Christo fascism.
mhm.
And I think it's important. One thing you raised, Reverend Tracy, is I think you point to it. It's important to look at there's a Christianity of faith, and then there's ideological Christianity. And ideological Christianity is when folk refract their faith or use as a standard for the Christianity what serves their interests and their own desires. And therefore, for instance, I cited a statistic in my latest book from a poll where most evangelicals, with regard to immigrants, say that what the Bible says about immigrants um, it doesn't affect their attitude about immigrants at all. I think it was like 80 something uh, percent. When the Bible repeatedly says over and over, since you were a ger, a stranger, or an immigrant in a strange land, then you should take care of other folk. And I cited many times, even tithing. One of the reasons tithing was instituted was to help take care of immigrants. And the Bible says to help immigrants get on their feet, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it couldn't be more clear. But these folk ignore it because they're ideological Christians. And it's important to make that distinction that when we look at these Christian nationalists, um, arguing with them about what the Bible says is not going to be a really fruitful experience. I think, we can lift up the gospel in the public sphere and contradict them and show people that what they're talking about is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. But it's a very pernicious, dangerous thing that we're facing, and we're not talking about it enough at all. It should be on every Christian's mind, every pastor's mind. We should be making sure people know the difference.
I want to
Dr.
read a few
Hendricks,
more.
Yes,
Go
ma'am.
ahead.
Dr. Hendricks and Reverend
Yes,
Blackman, can I just interject? There are several questions in the chat.
I was
sure.
about to start reading them. Yeah.
Okay, and there's the one that was asked quite a while ago. Can the church still mobilize and get involved to address social justice? That was the first one that I saw, and then there are several more. So if we can start maybe address.
If you keep up, Dr. Karen, because I'm losing track.
Okay, okay, that was the
I,
first one.
I want to answer that and then hear what Dr. Hendricks has to say about it. Yes, the church can still mobilize social justice. Dr. Hendricks gave you many ways that the church can do that. I'll give you one that worked very well in a small church, my church. Every time we would have our annual meeting and review what matters to the church, we would make a list of what matters to the church around children, what matters to the church around feeding the hungry, what matters
Mm,
to the church around housing. And we would have a scripture under each one of them. I would make a grid. And every election, we would take everyone who was running for a position and we would put them across the top of the grid and how their votes line up. We couldn't tell them
mm,
how to vote.
mm,
Even putting that in place for people who are not accustomed to thinking that way, right?
mm,
Sometimes I would fill it out for them and say, this is how they voted on this, this is how they voted on that. Sometimes I was busy. You have to do your research to find out how they voted on things. But my point is, in leadership, in whatever leadership you're in the church, if it's important to you, it will become important to those who follow you.
mm, mm,
So putting that grid together to help them understand, one of the things that happened in this election, even a lot of people who voted because we were so overwhelmed by choose Trump or choose Harris, many young people only voted for the president. People went into the polls, did not vote down ballot because
mm,
we aren't having conversations about
mm.
how we are to engage as citizens
That's
Yes,
in this
yes.
political world, right?
right.
And
Mm,
so the church, the Black church in particular, still has the opportunity on Sundays, on Wednesdays, virtually, to
mhm,
have these conversations. Even make such a grid for your young people and
mhm,
allow them to fill it out. Teach them how to choose a leader.
mhm,
Teach them.
yeah, mhm,
And it doesn't have to be elaborate. It can be according to what you can afford. So,
yeah,
yes, we can get involved with social justice.
yeah,
It's also important that we teach the difference between justice and charity
mm,
because we have churches that think they're doing social justice and what they're doing is charity.
yeah, and
If
that's
you're feeding somebody in your food kitchen, and even if you're doing it faithfully every week, it is not justice, it is charity.
because it doesn't address
It doesn't
it
address the
doesn't try
base
to
of the
address the
issue,
causes. Yeah,
right? So
yeah,
to do justice, that charity matters because they're hungry.
right, of
But
course.
to do justice is to get involved in the political aspect of that.
And it doesn't have to be heavy-handed. You're absolutely right. Because yes, the church can, because we have the mechanisms in place. We have Sunday school. We have
Yeah.
Bible study. You can get people to, well, it depends. If you got an entertainment church, folk will not stay after church. But, if you have a congregation, you can get people to come together and and share their issues, their fears, their concerns, like Reverend Tracy said. Yeah. So yes, we can, but not only can we, but we must. It is a gospel responsibility. And I get invited to speak in many venues in number of churches, and I what I what I do often is talk about what we're talking about today. We have to try to provide a different model. And I will say this: many of my ministerial colleagues, they go along to get along because, I mean, they're pastors, but this is also their livelihood, and that's how they support their families. But what I tried to share with them is that, um, quick story. I'm not going to give the whole thing, but I I, uh, I preached a sermon when I was in seminary, and it was not really a sermon. It turned out to be almost a political lecture, right? And afterward, the people were very nice. This was the elder people's service, and you gave a very nice talk there, Reverend. And I knew I had messed up, but because the title of my sermon was "The Political Economy of the Lord's Prayer." I mean, come on, that ain't no sermon. That was some academic stuff. But afterward, and the people were nice. They knew I tried my best, and I just started preaching. Well, saw this quite elderly woman coming from the back of the church on her walker, frowning like crazy, just looking at me angrily. And I'm saying, "Oh my God." And she's taking her time, moving as fast as she can, but it was very slow. And longer she took, more upset I got. Finally, she got up to me, and she said, "Reverend," I said, "Yes, ma'am. I always knew there was something wrong with what they was teaching us. And what that taught me is that the pew is ready when they hear it. It's the pulpit that's holding folk back. People know they're suffering. If we just open up the door a little bit, they can make more sense of it, and they will be involved. So yes, the people are ready. The church can do that if, and I think Tracy said earlier, if we have the will to do it. And so we have to go out and try to raise the will. Those of us who know better must go out and try to raise that kind of consciousness. Jesus did that in the Gospel of Mark, said he was always always on the way. I mean, he was there, always on the move. Well, he was going around trying to raise the people's consciousness. And we have a responsibility to. And if we do that, I think we can. I think we can make a difference. We can mobilize, and we must.
Dr. Orange, you're going to read the next question, or
Okay, yes, because we only have about 3 or 4 minutes before we do the survey. But it's what are some similarities and differences between Israel's desire for a king in 1 Samuel 8 and countries like ours, as evidence from the election, who seem to prefer a dictator or strongman over someone whose policies would have been designed with an emphasis on helping our neighbors? And I went to 1 Samuel and 8. And it read, "Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you."
Mm, mm. And the question again was, what is the difference?
What are some similarities and differences between
Oh,
Israel's desire for a
yeah,
king in countries like ours, as
yeah.
evidence from the election?
Well, they both come from a sense of unempowerment. There are two things, I think. The reason Israel wanted a king is because um, the people didn't feel safe. They felt uh, that they were at the whim of other kinds of forces, and they didn't have the military strength. The other thing is that they took for granted that a king would serve their interests, even though Samuel told them that would not be the case. That's what's happening in America today. These folk think, some of them even have been, a lot of them talking about, we want a dictator. We want Trump to be a dictator because, number one, they think that it's always going to serve their interests, and number two, they feel that that the world will not be what that the society can never be what they want unless there's somebody to knock others down. So I mean, so the difference here is that it's somewhat out of fear of being overwhelmed, but it's fear of being overwhelmed not by outsiders, but by those who think differently than you, and it's motivated by a lot by antipathy and hatred.
I, I want to add to that that I'm not completely convinced that the win of Donald Trump is just about wanting a king. Um,
No, it's not just
I
about
think
that.
that it's also very much about um, the way we have preached the gospel and that we haven't challenged the preaching of that gospel that suggests uh, that someone has to impose what God would have on all of society, and that we don't have healthy conversations about the fact that the church is the church and the empire is the empire, the
Mm,
state is the state, the church is the church, that our faith should not be legislated, no matter what our faith is, and our politics should not be theologized. We've
mm,
conflated things that I believe some people, not all, but more than enough to switch this election, were voting for what they thought was the salvation of this country, knowing that Donald Trump was not a representation of that. That's why they had that whole Cyrus narrative going. If you
mm.
didn't hear that, you have to go back. They were saying that Trump is the Cyrus of this generation.
Or as
It
Messiah.
doesn't, yeah, it doesn't matter what he does. God is using him to make sure that this world doesn't fall into the pits of hell. And that type of theology was not and is not confronted enough by progressive thought or even educated thought about what the Bible really says. And I'm not, I know Dr. Hendricks is doing his part. I'm saying in the churches where people are
Yeah.
sitting hearing this, they are not hearing a gospel that can be interrogated or can be challenged. I think that
Mm,
too happened in this election. Not what he's saying didn't happen, but that those two things working together made a difference.
I think you're right. I think you're right.
And then there's just one final question, if we can address it very quickly. Where did it go? How can the contemporary church, such as churches of color, become more effective communicators outside of our communities to the greater society?
Mm,
Well, I'll go first so Dr. Um, Hendricks
mm,
can have the last word.
mm.
Um, Contemporary church, as in Black church, are those two things being used interchangeably? Or can you read it again one more time?
Okay, let me go back to it. I'm sorry. Um, let's see. Where is it? I'm sorry.
While you're looking, I want to
How,
answer Linda that asked the question about she's being heard recent stories about pastors being told their sermons are too woke. Um, I
Yeah, that's
based
happening.
on the Beatitudes in Matthew 25,
Yeah.
a little tongue in cheek, but I would just take him to Jesus in the garden when the disciples kept falling asleep while he was praying, and he said, "Stay woke." So I
Mm,
don't take that seriously. I think that's just,
yeah. But then there are
yeah,
pastors, I've read there are a number of pastors who are doing that.
yes,
That
they
we're
are,
saying
but
that
they're,
they reject the ideological Christians again. It doesn't work
yeah,
for them.
yeah.
Jesus is too nice for them, too
okay,
loving.
the
Did you
question
So
find
is,
it, Dr. Owens?
yes, how can the contemporary church, such as churches of color, become more effective communicators outside of our communities to the greater society?
Well, we
hmm,
have to have, I mean, outreach is important. Uh, I think Reverend Tracy talked about discipleship earlier. Part of discipleship, and Matthew 28, going forth, Jesus said, "Go forth and make disciples," and the Greek word actually means students. And not try to convert people, but to go out and teach them what the gospel says. And I think that one thing that we can do is focus on the ethics and not so much on the theology. Well, I'm talking about justice to the people. Talk about, what it means to love your neighbor in a political way and all that. But we have to be outward looking. Not enough of our churches are outward looking. We can do that. We can have rallies. We can do this, that, and the other, and be outward. But also we can support our scholars and our scholar pastors in their writing and the dissemination of information. That's important. Reverend Tracy?
Amen. I agree with that. And I would add to that I think that the Black church and the progressive church has as much airspace as the conservative church. I think we have to change the messaging and what we use that space for. We're
Mm,
using it for prosperity gospel, individualism, name it and claim it, manifest blessings. If you do this, God is going to do this. We have to use the space differently,
yeah,
preaching and teaching a faith that will hold, not
yeah.
a God that is a proverbial Santa Claus. So it's
Mm,
not that we don't have the space, it's
mm,
that we are going for the easy kill, right?
mm,
And we need to use our space to really preach a God who accompanies us in this world, and a God who requires something from us, not for our soul, but for the bodies. That God is concerned about how we live on this earth. God is concerned about creation. And if we start to preach those messages with the airtime that we have,
mm.
then we will see a shifting begin to happen.
Yeah, and put our money where our mouth is.
Absolutely.
Not building, huge monuments to our own greatness and all of that. But you put our money out there to try to make a difference.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Reverend Blackman and Dr. Hendricks. We are running out of time. Certainly, we could go on and on and on. At this time, I'd like to put the survey in the chat. If those of you who are in attendance would be so kind to fill out the chat as we close out, and certainly want to thank everyone for their attendance tonight, and especially to our wonderful presenters, Reverend Tracy D. Blackman and Dr. Aubrey Hendricks Jr., for sharing on political actions from the gospel message. I also put in the chat the link for Dr. Hendricks' Substack, where he continues to write on these important matters. If you would like to subscribe to the Substack, the link is in the chat. The recording for this session will be sent to your email addresses, and you can also find it on the Hood Theological Seminary YouTube channel. Our next session in the series will occur after the first of the year, probably in February. And so you can check your inboxes, continue to look in your inboxes for that information. We hope that you all will join us again soon as we continue to discuss these important matters, particularly in this season. And we ask that you would fill out the survey. The link should be in the chat. Again, thank you so much, Reverend Blackman. We hope to invite you back to continue some very important discussion. And we thank you, Dr. Hendricks, for being an advisor to us in the Pathways for Tomorrow initiative on these contested issues and anti-racism didactics.
Thank you
So
so
Thank you
we'll
much.
so
stay.
much for this, Dr. Owens. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this time. And thank you for Dr. Hendricks for letting me hang
Yes.
with you.
Oh, my dear.
I
I
love
always
it.
enjoy you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you so
All
Yeah.
much.
right. All
Yeah.
right. We've got lots of work to do.
Mhm.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Lots of
So
work to
long.
do. All right. Good night. Thank you. Please fill out the survey, those of you who are still on.